Okay, welcome back to my book study that I am doing on Other People's Words, The Cycle of Low Literacy by Victoria Purcell Gates. There's the book again. And if you've been following along, our last video was on chapters 1 through 3. That was the first part. And we just kind of overviewed the book and discussed what it was going to be about and learned about the two subjects that this researcher uses. And today we will be picking up with 4 through 6. Alrighty, and that starts on page 66. Alrighty, starts on page 66 is where I'll be beginning. And just a little summary of these chapters. Purcell Gates helps Donnie and Jenny become literate. So that's basically what's going to happen. She begins that journey. And it's a journey that she doesn't they don't become wonderfully literate by the end of the book, but they are functionally literate by the end of the book, and just like heads and shoulders above where they began with, So that's where we'll be going today. Alright, so let me get my book right into the chapter. Got them all bookmarked. I got some good quotes today. Alrighty, so Gates realized that Donnie and Jenny, who Jenny's the mom again, Donnie is her son. She has another son also, and she has a husband, and they're also living semi-unliterately. They needed print to be in context, and they needed it to be meaningful. So the way they were living right now, they didn't use print. They didn't need print, so why did it mean anything? Why did they need to learn how to read? Why did Donnie need to learn that in school? They didn't have a negative attitude toward it, but Donnie did because he was struggling in school. But Jenny, who wanted him to read and wanted herself to learn how to read, it didn't fit into their life very much. So that was one of Gates's angles. That's where she kind of went in. And on page 69, I have a quote about Donnie. He must observe, participate in, and experiment with written language being used for many different real-life purposes. So that was her approach. She worked and ran something called the Literacy Center at the college she worked at. Again, I think this is in Cincinnati, but they don't for sure tell you. And at her Literacy Center, that's what she wanted to work on. Alright, so she wanted real life purposes for this print. So he would see that he needed to read, it really did work in his life. And I have one on 68 too. Alright, this is Jenny talking about reading. Well, I can't read them. I can read them okay now. Okay, like father. I couldn't read that for the longest time. And I had a paper. The words that was hard for me that I didn't know, I had them written down. And then when I would go to it, somehow I would remember it by looking at the paper and the way I'd written them down. And then I'd just go on. And then she goes on to say, I can read them in here, her little book. But if there's anywhere else, I don't know them. So she was learning how to read some words, but just like by memorization, and like she said, she could only picture them on that paper, so they had no meaning. She couldn't read them anywhere else. She couldn't go up to a sign on a store and read them. So that's what Gates is talking about. They need to be meaningful. They need to be in their life. And then on 71, we talk about the language acquisition and the learning principles that she goes by. So this is all like researched, and she's coming at it from a real scholarly angle, Language, one of the learning principles were, language is learned as it is used to fulfill meaningful, authentic functions and cannot be learned for its own sake, in isolation from function. So that's like learning sight words just on a little flashcard, that doesn't mean anything. You need to read them in a book. You need to read them on a sign. You need to read them in a newspaper. There needs to be meaning for them to make sense and to stick in your head. Alright. The Literacy Center did not approach, this is just my own notes, this isn't from the book. Literacy Center did not approach reading like most skill building, like instruction in schools, but it made it fulfill these authentic purposes of print. So they didn't go in I don't know, how you would teach your short letter sounds. They didn't just go in that order and then do digraphs and then do this. It was really an immersive mix of that, doing real life things. So it wasn't like they would just get a list of spelling words to copy or your sight word flashcards to learn. They would be doing real life applicable things. And I have a few examples of some of those activities. So for Donnie, Whenever he would come in, she wanted to build a culture of literacy, which I'm going to mention again later too, because that was a big thing. Because they didn't, at home, they just didn't value literacy. They didn't use they didn't read. They didn't do anything with print, you know? So she wanted to build that culture. If it's ingrained in you, like little kids who go to bed getting read a story every night, it's part of them, you know? Like, they valued that. That's part of their lives. So she read to him every time he came in. And he was surrounded in a social environment of literacy. So just everywhere he was in literacy. There were people reading in this literacy center. There were people writing. There were people learning from other teachers. So this was like, it's a social thing. And she says in the book that he couldn't help but be drawn in. You know, he wanted to do that too. So that was part of it. On page 73, she talks about an activity. She would read a like really predictable book several times, and then she would have Donnie like kind of read it back to her because he could memorize it after a while. And then she would have the sentences from the book, like if it was brown bear, she would have brown bear, what do you see, like on a little strip. And he would cut apart, he would read this as a sentence, see the sentence, see the capital letter, see the period, look at all the sentence-y factors of there. There's words in a line spaced out, and he would cut apart the words. So he would have sentences, he would cut them into words, and then after the words, he would cut them into letters. So that just built his print skills so that he saw what these things mean, you know, how this A goes into that word, and that word goes into a sentence, and the sentence you can read it in a book, it has meaning. So she did that. That was an activity they did a lot. They did a lot of writing also, so he would copy down words from books, like kind of in that sort of a fashion, or maybe he would tell her a story and she would write it down for him to begin with, so that he could see, and she did this with Jenny too, so he could see that his words, like, oh my gosh, I can read my own words, you know, like talking is important to them. Well, talking, you can just translate that right down to reading if you write it. So she did that, and after a while he worked on encoding and then inventive spelling. I have page 76 written down for that. And I don't think I'm going to go into that. That just basically talks about the individual like units of like the letters, you know, and how they made sounds and how he would put those together and kind of learn how to do that slowly. So he did, and I really like the inventive spelling element of that because like that's just something I can use in my own classroom, you know, like it's big. And I've seen the kids in my classroom, when we do inventive spelling, they're like, oh my gosh, like I can write that. And like I can read it, and they get really excited whenever I can read what they wrote. Like if they'll write me like little notes or they'll write on their papers, like I can read it. So they get super excited. So I think inventive spelling is important because it builds your confidence there, and it built Donnie's confidence, and it makes you feel like you can write, you know? Like it's the first step, and you're actually writing, you know, fluently in a way. And again, she made literacy cultural for him. She would take Donnie and Jenny to the library. She got them library cards. She would help them check out books. She would send them home with books. She would have Jenny they could listen to the books on tape and read the books while they went. So she just wanted it to be part of like their everyday life. She wanted them to have stuff at home, like paper and pencils, so they could sit there and write. And if Donnie wanted to write a little story, he could, you know. But Donnie did not want to read or write on his own because he just hadn't grown up in that environment. So it was kind of hard for him, and it was hard for Gates to really get him to want to. But she worked on it, and she did. Like I said, they're not like these wonderful, beautiful, fluent readers by the time the study's over, but they are heads and shoulders above where they were. She did teach them how to read. They became literate. You know, they valued print by the end of it. And Jenny, so she let her write and read her own words. So like Jenny would say something and Gates would write it down, and then like Jenny could read it back and be like, and she got really excited because those were her own words in print. She'd never seen them before. She can read what she said. And she would give her like a journal, and Jenny would have to write journal entries, and it could be about anything. And Gates says that as they went on, they became more like cohesive and comprehensive and easier to read, and they started to make sense. So she kind of learned how to write as she went too, you know, like she would read it back and Gates would read it with her, and then they would read other things and kind of compare, you know, like the sentence structure, just talking, like how it's different a little bit in writing. But that was good. It made it meaningful. The words meant something because they're about her life, you know. And it was a little bit hard she wanted to read, you know, but the little, like, simple leveled readers that you would give to a little kid, that doesn't mean anything to an adult. That they wouldn't be interested, they wouldn't want to do that. She wanted to read, but that wouldn't really do anything. So she did all these other kind of alternative activities to make it meaningful again. That's her whole thing. This has to be meaningful. This has to be pushed into your culture, you know, your way of life. She listened to books on tape, and that would help her kids read, and she really, really enjoyed that. And she wanted to be good like that one day, you know. Jenny really wanted to learn how to read. And in her journals, she did write about her husband going to jail for selling pot. And just to read those journal entries, it's like you were there, like, because it's all just straight up from her point of view. And that's a really hard time to read about in her life. Just their life in general. Again, talking about the urban Appalachian culture from last time. It was rough, you know. And then her husband goes to jail. The guy who was, like, making all the money in the family goes to jail. And she's this single mom with 2 little kids. And he's in jail for 6 months. And that's a big part in the book. Jenny's a strong woman, you know, and I think that goes to show why she figured out how to read as an adult, you know, like she learned because she wanted to, because she was driven to, because she wanted to help her kids. It's a really interesting part of the book, just to hear about her. And they both do make improvements. Like I said, they're not going to become beautiful, wonderful, fluent readers by the end, but they will know how to read, and they will be able to use their skills in the real world, which was what Gates really wanted them to be able to do. And that's part 2. That's the middle of the book. Next time, we will be summing up the book and kind of talking about, like, real-world applications of what you can learn in the book. Alrighty. Thank you for joining me. See you next time.